Hello. In this film I want to talk to you about papers for hand printing specifically. So printing by hand has a couple of things about it that will affect the choice of paper, and I'm going to go on to that in a minute, but I'm going to start with the basics. So I've got a few papers here that I want to talk about. The first thing is thinking about the colour of the paper. So I normally work with a white paper, but there are some rather beautiful natural colours. So I've got a selection of natural coloured papers here, and if we go to my bad proof prints of my Bucks pictures, you can see I wouldn't go with a natural coloured paper for a print like this, because this graphic print of Bucks, it's quite crisp, and the whole point is going to be these bright white daisies and that white cloud at the back. So if I go with a natural coloured print, natural coloured paper rather than a white paper, I'm going to lose that kind of bright crispness. So that's out for that print. But this one that I'm thinking of doing as a sort of evening version, these natural colours might work very well. I wouldn't go for this greeny colour, beautiful though it is, because it would kill the sky. It would work fine for the landscape, but it would kind of kill the sky, which I'm hoping is going to be quite subtle tones, peachy tones. So that one's out. But any of these would warm up the print and bring life to the quiet evening landscape. So that would be certainly worth thinking about. So, you know, natural coloured papers can be really helpful for some prints, but not for others. So that's one of the things that I would think about. The other thing is about whether the paper has any fibres showing in it. So in this paper here, there are natural fibres and hairs, and it's a beautiful part of that paper. Again, it would, if I were choosing to use paper like this, I'd be looking for quite an organic, fluid sort of landscapey scene where that fibre would fit in. I don't know that I would use it for, if I did them, a nice crisp urban scene, because I don't think it would work as well. The other thing to think about is if you're selling work, then it's got to be obvious to the client that all these hairy bits are a sort of beautiful part of the paper, because if there's just the random mark, you'll get people sort of poking at the frame and saying, oh look, there's something trapped on the paper, I don't like that. And telling people about the paper actually is a really nice part of when I'm selling work. I quite often discuss the paper that I use with people. So it can be a nice story if you're using a beautiful handmade paper like that. So that's something to think about. So when you print by hand, the paper naturally gets more battering than it does if it goes through a press, because you're physically rubbing at it and looking at it and manipulating it. And the way that I work, if you've been following me, you'll know I have lots and lots of layers to my print. So this series that we're working on at the moment, there are only 4 printing blocks, but I often go back and use a block maybe 2 or 3 times, so that number of layers builds up. So when I'm printing by hand, what I'm looking for is a paper that can take the physical battering, but is not so thick and stiff that I'm killing myself rubbing the back of it. Because if I want to do 10 prints with maybe 8 or 9 layers per print, that's 90 rubbings, and that's a lot of work. So I favour Japanese papers, and I've talked about them before, but I'm going to go through the reasons for favouring them again. But before I do that, just a couple of other papers that I use. This is just cheap laser copier paper. I think this is 80 grams. And this I would use for what I would call trash prints. So if I'm just running off a quick print and I want to check alignment or something like that, and I'm just going to throw the piece of paper away, I would use that. And I also use, and I've got an example here, I use cheap tracing paper for when I want to take a print off the lino and then put that wet print down onto another piece of lino and rub it onto the lino so that I can check registration, which I've talked about in other films. So I use tracing paper and cheap paper like that for testing. But to go back to the printing paper and why I favour Japanese washi papers when I'm hand printing is because they're phenomenally strong, and the reason they're strong is because of the way the paper is constructed. And I have a decorative Japanese paper here. This is from Awagami, and if I just unroll it, and let me just put a couple of random things on it just to hold it out. There we go. So you can really see, this isn't a printmaking paper, but I thought you'd like to see it because it shows the fibres here. Japanese paper, Japanese washi paper, is a long fibred paper. In the West, paper is usually pulped, and that's short fibre lengths. And here you can see there are very long fibres, but washi paper generally has a long fibre in it. And when the paper is constructed, the fibres are shaken and tangle. And because they're tangled, it makes the paper very strong. If you think of bulletproof vest material or those Tyvek, those non-tear envelopes, that's what's going on there. It's a tangle of long threads. So because of this long thread construction, the paper can be quite lightweight and yet still be very sturdy, which is brilliant when you're hand rubbing, because lightweight means less effort for you, and the sturdiness means that the paper's going to last through all those layers of printing. So that's that paper. It's not a printmaking paper, but I intend to print with it. It just needs a very specific design, which I haven't come up with yet, but I know it's going to come into its own, this paper, soon. The other thing I've got just to show you, just out of interest really, again, this isn't a printmaking paper. This is, let me turn it the other way up, maybe you can see better. This is the paper that you would use in Japan for screen doors and windows. So if you think about traditional Japanese architecture where you have a frame which is divided up into panes and then there's paper in those panes, this is a roll of that paper. And it's lightweight enough to allow light to come through, but sturdy enough to be part of the architecture. So that, again, it's not designed to print on, but I might have a little play with it and see, seeing as I've got it. And I'm hoping it will show it, and I'm not sure if it does or not, but there is a lustre to Japanese washi. It has a sort of almost a gleam about the paper. It's really hard to show on film, but if you handle it, you can see it has a kind of almost a lustre to it, which is really, really lovely. Sort of sheeniness about it. So let's get rid of that and go back to the papers that I was showing you earlier. So I'm using Awagami paper for this project. Simply because they do a really good sample pack, which is available in the UK, and it's easy to get hold of. So in this sample pack, there's a whole selection of different washi papers, and I think there are 10 different types. A couple of them are quite thick, and I won't be using on this project. They are, let me just check because there's a label on the back. Yeah, 170 gram and 220 gram papers. They're too thick for me to use. If you want to work in water-based ink, in this project I'm going to work in oil-based ink like I usually do, but if you want to work in water-based ink and you want to do lots and lots of layers, then a thicker paper can be very good, especially if you aren't working with Japanese washi, if you're working with Western paper, because water-based inks can cockle the paper because of the water, and when you start printing, if you've got lots of layers, it can actually start to make the paper a bit wavy. So that's the one thing I would say. if you are using water-based inks, then maybe go for a slightly sturdier paper to allow for the fact that there's water involved and it might cockle the paper. So I'm not going to use those, I'm going to use the finer weight. So here, let's move this out of the way. We're filming this, by the way, on my studio apron. We wanted a dark background and there's a couple of pockets, in case you're wondering what it is we're filming on. So I'm going to use this paper, and as you can see, some of it is really quite lightweight indeed. I've got a paper here which is 46 grams, and that's not a problem. I would certainly use that for hand printing. Indeed, I will use that for hand printing, but I'm using very thin layers. That's the other thing to think about, is how thickly you apply your ink. So you can use very thin and get away with it and know it's strong enough. And then I think the heaviest one I'm going to use is going to be around about the 90 grams. Maybe there's one here, 110. It's the heaviest weight that I'm going to use to hand print with. So Japanese washi is not the cheapest of papers, and that's to do with the construction processes of making it, which do increase the price. And I would say it's worth it, as it will give you a really good result. But there are, of course, other papers available. There was, when I was a student way back in the 80s, you used to be able to get stuff called imitation Japanese, which was quite sturdy and lightweight paper. And I think I used to buy it from Lawrence's, which in those days was in Bleeding Heart Yard in London, and it's now in Hove. But they have a very good selection of Japanese papers, and I think they still sell imitation Japanese. The other paper that I'm going to use for this project, which is terrific stuff, is still Japanese, which is this Hosho paper. I think this is very good value. You can buy these pads from Hand Printed down in Bognor and from Intaglio in London. And this is, again, it's a fairly lightweight paper, but it's quite sturdy, and I know some of you already use that, so that's another one that I would recommend. But paper is a really personal thing, so I would, if you're just starting out, I would try and get a few samples and pick up a selection and play with them, and chances are that you'll find some papers that suit you, and you can stick to 2 or 3 that do the jobs that you want, and that's a very effective way. Sometimes if you go, I mean, I know during lockdown we can't do this, but at art shows where there are suppliers, they often give out sample packs, and a lot of shops, online shops, will do a sample pack of papers. So I would encourage you to buy a sample pack and just run some tests, play with it and find out what suits you, because we're all different and what I like may not be what you like. But at least that's given you some basics and a few thoughts about paper. And we'll look at paper a lot more when I come to do the actual printing as well, how it's behaving throughout the printing. So I hope you found that useful, and I hope you'll join me again for another film.